Sorry, we forgot to do that earlier.
I'm going to give about another 30 seconds. I've got a timer so that then we can move forward. But these are all really interesting, really good. Okay, so for just the sake of time, we have to keep moving forward, but if you still have more comments, you can definitely put them in the chat. Okay, next slide. So we're gonna come back to this reflection with a word cloud, so hold on tight to it. But if you still have any other ideas of words that come to you, feel free to put them in the chat. Okay, next slide. All right, so before I can get into talking about the larger subjects for this lecture, I want to give a brief snapshot around immigration today. So click, there we go. Thank you. So let's talk first about global current trends. At least 79, but you can also talk about over 80 million people around the world have been forced to flee their homes. And among them, about nearly 26 are considered to be refugees. Almost half of them are under the age of 18. This year alone, asylum seekers submitted over 2 million new refugee claims. The United States is one of the world's largest recipients of new individual applications. They get on average over 300,000. That doesn't mean acceptance, that means just applications. And developing, but here's the other thing is that developing countries where refugees are often staying are in countries that are neighboring countries. So the places that they fled from. So, and most of them are also developing countries. So developing countries host about 85% of the world's refugees. And the sad part is so here's the number that we see globally, but less than 100,000 are resettled every year. That's not even like a drop in a bucket. Like that would be too generous. That is how many are resettled every year. When we look at current trends in the United States historically has and still has more immigrants than any country in the world. Today, more than 40 million people living in the US were born in another country, accounting for about 1/5 of the world's migrants. Since 1965, when US immigration laws replaced what was then a national quota system, which was used to keep out many minorities, the number of immigrants living in the United States has more than quadrupled. Immigrants today count for 13% of the US population, nearly triple the share than it was in 1970, which was around 4.8. For this lecture, and because of my work, I do want to focus on a particular area of immigration. There's a lot of ways you can immigrate to this country in regards to whether that's a student visa, work visa, partnership, and so forth. There's a lot to cover. For this lecture, we're just going to be talking about mostly asylum, and especially asylum coming into the United States. So a lot of asylum seekers are people who have resettled here in the United States. Since the creation of the federal resettlement program in 1980, about 3 million refugees have been resettled in the US, more than another country. Resettle means is that they fled their country of origin to a neighboring country or a country nearby. They then claim asylum and then ask to be resettled somewhere else, somewhere safer. So for example, the United States. For 2019, the annual ceiling for those who are being resettled was set at 30,000. And for this year, 2020, it has been set at 18,000. These are astronomically low levels. They're the lowest that they've ever been since the resettlement program was created in 1980. And it's been a deliberate effort by the current administration to essentially stop resettlement. I want to talk about two other sort of important ones, and this is where a lot of my work comes in working with asylum seekers. And the first two sort of asylums, so these are people who are coming to the US border or have already come into the United States and then asking for asylum. The first one is affirmative asylum. Affirmative asylum refers to those making an asylum claim within a year of their entry into the United States, or immediately once they've hit a US port of entry, a border, you get off on a plane, that type of thing. Affirmative asylum is handled by an asylum officer. In 2019, there was an estimated 84,000 affirmative asylum applications that were received by the US Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is much less than actually previous years, and about 40% fewer than it was even 2 years ago, 40% fewer than 2 years ago, which was around 140,000 in 2017. This marks the second year of dwindling and declining applications after 8 years of growth of people coming in to claim asylum. And a part of that reason is, as we're going to talk about, is the efforts by the current administration to stop asylum seekers from even claiming asylum when they get here. You might be asking, okay, so for those who do claim asylum here, how many get approved? According to the US Citizenship and Immigration Services, 31% of affirmative asylum petitions are approved. So in 2019, it was around 31%, a slight increase from 30% in 2018, but a huge decline from the previous years, where about 43% was in 2016 and 37% were approved in 2017. Defensive asylum refers to claiming asylum when removal proceedings are in place. So you're already here in the United States, and for example, you, for whatever reason, like your visa expires, so then you have to be removed, or you came here undocumented, or so forth, and you have a removal procedure on you. You can claim asylum. They're not handled by asylum officers, they're handled by immigration courts, which are much harder to get acceptance in. But if an immigration judge finds that the individual is eligible for asylum, then the order will be granted. But if they find them ineligible for asylum, the immigration judge will determine if other forms of relief are available to them, including relief from against torture or something like that. If no other sort of relief is available, then the immigration judge will order the person to be removed from the United States. In 2019, 29% of defensive asylum claims were approved versus 43% in 2016 and 37% in 2017. And 33% in 2018. I think you're seeing a pattern here. There's also the huge thing of backlog. Due to the large application of volume and limited resources in processing asylum claims, both affirmative and defensive, it has meant that we have an extensive backlog system where people are waiting years for their asylum, for their day in court, or to talk to an asylum officer. At the end of September 2019, according to Citizenship and Immigration, there were over 340,000 affirmative cases, and that's just the affirmative cases, not even the defensive one, still pending. Okay, next slide. So obviously these numbers can sort of show you a pattern, and what I want to talk about now are some of the US immigration policy trends that are particularly affecting refugees. The Trump administration has, to no surprise if you're paying attention to the news at all, has instituted a number of new policies, many being challenged in court. So some of them are like in this gray area of is it happening, is it not, which just is terrible for anybody who having to deal with it. But much of the sort of policies have meant to deter families from immigrating, accessing asylum, or being resettled. A lot of these policies are being directed to those coming to the US southern border who are claiming asylum or other pathways to immigration. Policies such as migrant protection protocols, also known as MPP, also known as the Remain in Mexico policy. So under MPP, individuals who cross at the southern border and ask for asylum, either at a port of entry or crossing the border between ports of entry, are given notice to appear in immigration court and sent back to Mexico. They are instructed to then return to a specific area to claim a specific port of entry at a specific date and time for their next court hearing. Certain groups are being considered exempt from this process, meaning that they won't immediately be sent back to Mexico to see if they can have a hearing or not, such as unaccompanied minors and individuals determined by an asylum officer to be more likely than not to face torture or persecution in Mexico on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. But here's the thing, these are all discretionary. The person who's making these decisions are the Border Patrol. So they are not accountable. They don't have to sort of answer to anything really. They can just sort of decide based on what you tell them. And if you're afraid to tell them some things, to make this decision for you, that can literally cost you life or death. If asylum seeker does talk to them and are able to affirmatively assert their fear of remaining in Mexico, they are then sent to an asylum officer for review. The Border Patrol keeps them in custody for these interviews and are not allowed access to an attorney. Some individuals report being handcuffed through the interview process. Government estimates of number of people who've passed these interviews range from 1% to 13%. And here's the thing, when you're sent back to Mexico, you're not provided any sort of support. So no sort of access to medical care, housing, resources while you wait to have an appointment, leaving people to fend for themselves. Many are homeless. Many of them have created shelters. And it creates this really sort of dangerous situation, particularly for those in very vulnerable categories like LGBTQ individuals. Given these issues, a lot of people who are then sent back to Mexico to remain in Mexico oftentimes just leave because the situation is not safe for them. They don't know where to go. And then, you know, they then miss their court date and so forth. The next sort of policy that the current administration has been heavily using is called metering. So metering has always been around. Metering is the term that the Customs and Border Patrol use for a process by which it limits the number of people who can request asylum at a port of entry. And it's really only referring to the US-Mexico border. In November 2019, the Strauss Center estimated that more than 21,000 individuals were waiting in border cities across Mexico just for the opportunity to start the asylum process. Wait times vary from 1 to 3 days and more. So moving on, so the next sort of issues that have been happening in regards to, again, asylum seekers is the Prompt Asylum Claims Review, is also known as PACR. The Prompt Asylum Claim Review is for people who are non-Mexican nationals claiming asylum. Migrants who are in this program are kept in the US Customs and Border Protection facilities instead of detention centers run by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This program essentially makes it very difficult or impossible for asylum seekers to seek outside help, legal counseling, advocacy, and so forth. As somebody who works with refugees, I don't know how many people are in there. And if there's somebody, particularly since I work with LGBTQ refugees, I don't know if they're in there. And that is a big issue in regards to having their cases be heard and approved. The other process is also similar to the prompt. It's the humanitarian asylum review process. It's pretty much the same setup, but this only applies to Mexican nationals applying for asylum. And again, Individuals are never transferred to immigration detention areas. Instead, they remain locked in these short-term detention facilities by the Border Patrol through the entire process. And no shocking there, then the success rate of getting asylum once you're put into this program is very low. Okay, next one. Safe third country and asylum transit ban. So a new thing, it is this interesting thing of how they're using policies that have already been in place, but are using them in a way to further deter as well as target very vulnerable individuals. Safe third country has always been here. So it's been here since the 1951 Refugee Convention. And what it essentially means is that, like, if you are, and it really applies to like countries in Europe, or at least the intended purpose was for that, is that if once you always have to leave your country to claim asylum. Like, you can't claim asylum within your country. So once you leave, and if you've traveled through a country that is considered to be safe, meaning that then what that means is that you need to claim asylum into that country. You can't just like walk or travel to a country that you prefer to claim asylum. That process has always been here, and it's meant to sort of make sure to sort of alleviate some of the burden on other countries as well. The thing is that, you know, for example, if you enter the United States, but you want to claim asylum in Canada, because who wouldn't? You can't, because you should have claimed asylum in the United States because you were in technically a third safe country. Mexico has always been this gray area, you know, for many reasons. It is, for a long time, before the Trump administration, was not considered a safe third country for a variety of reasons, but particularly for vulnerable minorities like LGBTQ, women, people with HIV and AIDS, and so forth. That is no longer the case. So Mexico is now considered a safe third country. And with that, then, to further ensure this, the Trump administration has created an asylum transit ban, basically meaning that if you travel to another country and claim asylum, and then come up here to claim asylum, and that could be like you are traveling from, you know, Honduras, and then you come through Mexico and then come up here, you technically can't claim asylum in the United States because you've already traveled in a country that you could have technically claimed asylum into. It creates this process by which individuals basically are denied access to asylum before they even get there. Let's see. All right, last one. So the last one has been really impactful, particularly for LGBTQ refugees, and I'll talk more about it later on. But the other thing that the current administration has done is changing the procedures, or proposing to change procedures for asylum and withholding of removal. And that has been around changing the standard of proof and qualifications to claim asylum. So whenever you claim asylum, you kind of have to prove two things. You have to prove basically who you are that you say you are. Essentially, like, I am this person. Here's documents that show you that I am this person, my birth certificate, whatever. And then you need to, which shows you like that you're credible and that you are who you say you are. The other one is that you need to show fear, meaning that you need to show a proof of fear, that I am fearful or of returning to my country because of X, Y, and Z. And if you cannot successfully articulate that, defend yourself to an asylum officer or an immigration court, your asylum will be rejected. Now, that's always been the case. That's a standard sort of issues when you claim asylum. But now this changing standard of proof has been that essentially those who claim asylum based on being a member of a particular social group, essentially vulnerable, making it has meant that they are no longer being counted. So people who are fleeing domestic violence has been one of them, that they don't want to have it count as a particular social group. LGBTQ individuals. It's made it virtually impossible for a person who's a member of a social group, then the four specified groups that the Trump administration has said, which is race, religion, nationality, or political opinion, from ever qualifying for asylum. This includes Central Americans fleeing from gang violence, women fleeing from a domestic abuse, as I said before, as well as LGBTQ individuals. The other thing is that it is narrowly defined, the Trump administration has narrowly defined persecution as essentially being involving a severe level of harm. What that means is that persecution, whereas before, like when we talk about persecution, particularly and we talk about in regards to minorities and people who experience multiple forms of oppression, you know, oftentimes it's not so direct, like you aren't being arrested or you're not, or you have a weapon to your head or something like that. Oftentimes it's just daily persecution, daily violence, everyday violence, which prior to the current administration, you could prove is like, that's also persecution. Me being afraid as a queer person to go outside and hold the hand of my partner because we're afraid that we could lose our job, our house will get messed up, we'll get harassed, etc., is no longer being seen as persecution. So these are the issues that are particularly impacting all refugees, but especially the community that I work mostly with. And I'll talk a little bit more about the particularities around this later on, but I did want to sort of give you like, here's the landscape that we have. And what you see in this landscape is essentially a very deliberate effort by the current administration to deny people on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of sexuality, and so forth. It is a very deliberate attack, as well as effort by this current administration to stop what they would consider undesirable migrants, essentially based on race, gender, class, and sexuality. The last thing that I do want to touch upon is family separation and forced sterilization. And that is something that we've talked about, that hopefully you've seen in the news, which is something that is good that it's been talked about in the news. So family separation is a policy that has been here since prior to the Obama administration. It was used during the Obama administration, but under the Trump administration, they enforced a zero tolerance policy. Because before, you know, when migrants would come with families, they could, they would get detained, but then they would be released together. Now the zero tolerance policy has meant that anybody who crosses the border without permission, including those seeking asylum, must be referred to the Department of Justice for prosecution. Basically, they're charged with a crime. So undocumented asylum seekers or just any sort of migrant coming here are imprisoned, and any accompanied children under the age of 18 are handed over to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And they are then shipped miles away from their parents, scattered among 100 Office of Refugee Settlement, foster care systems, and so forth. The ACLU did file a class lawsuit when this policy was put into place, and it was granted preliminary injunction requiring U.S. immigration authorities to reunite most of the families that have been separated. Despite this injunction, separations continue. The official count of children separated from their parents or guardians is over 4,000 as of May 2020. And again, these numbers are actually pretty hard to track. They are terrible at keeping records almost deliberately. And as reports are starting to come out, the abuse of children, young adults, mothers, and other individuals have been also reported in these detention centers. Limited access to sanitation, healthcare, let alone advocacy with lawyers and other human rights advocates. And just recently, last week, we've heard about the news of the forced sterilization are just one example of government abuses happening in these detention centers, where there's limited to no access to the outside. Okay, next slide. So, as concerning as these trends are, and by all means, they are concerning. They are very upsetting. Oh, go back. They are sadly nothing new when it comes to looking at the history of the United States, which is a long legacy of regulating, oppressing, and violating indigenous persons as well as persons of color, as well as migrants of color. Whether that's forced sterilization of American Indians, African Americans, Latinx individuals, immigration bans, policing, prisons, denial of citizenship and sovereignty, we need to see these trends, these current trends in immigration, as not something that is just related to the Trump administration or just happening now, but instead see this as for what it is, which is a long pattern of violence and abuse that has been intertwined within the very fabric of our country in these systems of power. Systems of power are the beliefs, practices, and cultural norms in which individual lives and institutions are built. They are oppressive, and they define relationships between marginalized communities and dominant culture. They also shape the social norms and experiences within marginalized communities. Two systems of power I want to focus on next is colonialism and imperialism. Next one. So this might be a review for some of you, so forgive me for that, but I do want to make sure that we're all on the same page when we talk about these things and that we're using the same language. So let's get into it. So colonialism essentially is a practice of domination and which involves the subjugation of one people by a dominant other. It involves the exploitation of resources, and that involves like land, labor, the raw and processed goods that you create. You could also call this the means of production. The practice of colonialism usually involves the transfer of a population to a new territory where the arrivals live as permanent settlers, maintaining political allegiance to their countries of origin. Or in the case of the United States, we have what is called settler colonialism, which is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations within an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinct identity and sovereignty. Settler colonialism's goal is essentially to permanently occupy and assert sovereignty over indigenous lands. Therefore, it's really important to think about settler colonialism as a structure, not an event. It's not something that happened in the past, it's happening in the present. It persists on the ongoing elimination of indigenous populations, Native Americans, American Indians, and the assertion of state sovereignty and judicial control over their lands. Settler colonialism seeks to its own end. Unlike other types of colonialism out there, which the goal is to maintain colonial structures and power between the colonizer and the colonized, settler colonialism is about ending the colonial difference in the form of supreme and unchallenged settler state and people. The drive is not to decolonize, but rather an attempt to eliminate the challenges posed to settler sovereignty. It's really important though, especially in the context that we're going to be talking about, is that when we talk about settler colonialism, you don't want to think about it as being monolithic, meaning that it's the same for everybody, meaning that it's just settlers versus indigenous people here in the United States. And that's really important because at the heart of settler colonialism is hierarchy. It's based along whiteness, patriarchy, and heteronormativity, favoring ever since the first settlers' colonies in Jamestown, which are mostly white, straight, male-dominated society. So for those who are immigrating to this country, they are then forced within this settler colonial matrix, which is a very racial, gendered, and sexual hierarchy where they are, whether they came here as forced or enslaved labor, such as in the history of many African Americans, to coming here for work or transitory migrants or even new immigrants coming here. Everybody is being situated within that settler colonial matrix. They are settlers as well, and we can talk about our relationships to the displaced peoples of this land, but they are also oppressed within the settler colonial matrix. Their access to settle in this country, let alone live well, equal rights, not be shot by police. All of these sort of things are very much governed by a settler colonial hierarchy that is based on whiteness, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. When we step outside of the United States and talk about globally, we can talk about imperialism. Essentially, imperialism is at how one country exercises power over another, whether through settlement, sovereignty, or indirect mechanisms of control. Oftentimes, imperialism and colonialism are put together because they're all about domination and control. But the differences between imperialism versus colonialism is the global focus. Oftentimes when we think about imperialism, we think about great European empires, right? That have and the countries they colonize becoming independent. But the truth is that even when these countries become independent, the structures of power that imperialism relied upon, mainly the exploitation of resources, goods, and peoples from one country to service the needs and the demands for the empire, never left even after independence. We see this very much in regards to talking about global economies in the former colonized states, where when you see this sort of division between developed versus undeveloped or lesser developed lands, and you see the history that many of these sort of underdeveloped countries are former colonized states, because truthfully is that the structures of power never left. There's still sort of the global north taking resources from the global south, you know, not investing, not anything like that. Because imperialism relies on capitalism, and capitalism never left, even when these countries became independent. So you have large corporations, like for example, the Canadian company Goldcorp, coming to countries like Guatemala, exploiting mineral rights and labor, in the process then also causing horrific ecological and social devastation to the lands. These huge capital gains that these companies have in these countries don't come back to the people of Guatemala. They don't come back to the local communities affected by these mines. Instead, there's no real sort of exchange of resources, knowledge, or so forth. Instead, it's still a one-way direction. The US is not only a settler colonial state, it's also imperial. American imperialism consists of policies aimed at extending the political, economic, and cultural influence of the United States over areas beyond its boundaries. This is very much the case in regards to Central and South America, where pretty much every country the US has been heavily involved in and enforcing control and influence. Oftentimes not for the country's benefit, but for the US economic, political benefit. What happens is it creates something that we call a global apartheid, where lesser developed countries are exploited and not given equal access to power. For those navigating this global apartheid, it creates a system where you have one global population having access to travel and benefit from resources being produced, communicated, and exchanged, and a whole other portion of the world being denied these. Okay, so I just told you a lot of information. Let's now unpack it some more in a small discussion.
Yeah, so I think we'll just go on and share in our group, since there's just a few of us here today. Now that we have those meanings of the structures of colonialism and imperialism, feel free to answer these questions in the chat or unmute. We're thinking about what are the reasons why people migrate in the first place, and who are the people who are most likely to be displaced from these structures of settler colonialism and imperialism.
I think for the second question, I think another I think for the first part, definitely indigenous, but I think like even within that sort of group, there is like a trend where the occupying force will try to make alliances with like indigenous people that are quote unquote higher class or contain power and influence, and create alliances with them and like kind of put them in positions of power so that they can quote unquote rule like the country or the sovereign nation that's they're trying to like dominate. So I think like the people most at risk are those that are indigenous, but also don't carry as much social influence or like, are higher up socioeconomically.
Hi, I think one of the reasons that people migrate and how it's combined or associated with imperialism can be seen in a lot of Latin American and Central American countries, you know, where the United States went in during the early part of the 20th century and later, and actually exploited the labor there, Dole Fruit and companies like that, Chiquita, and created such horrible economic conditions and also wars that people really couldn't sustain themselves there, and that, you know, really necessitated moving somewhere else. And we are seeing the results of that today. So this is very, very current. And certainly we have so many people around the world migrating because of economic situations, but also because of climate disasters. So, you know, these are people just like us that are, you know, really oppressed by the ruling class in this country primarily. So I think those are some of the reasons people leave. And I think it's just incredibly courageous, you know, war.
Yeah. I think Rex wrote a really good comment about social ethnic distinctions also get artificially inscribed in this hierarchical manner that didn't necessarily exist before. That is very much the case also with settler colonialism, particularly when we talk about the history of sexuality within a settler colonial state. A lot of the sort of laws around banning same-sex sexual interactions, such as sodomy and so forth, were imposed onto indigenous populations, as well as in regards to other policies like Indian resettlement programs, education, Indian education, boarding schools, and so forth, were very much deliberate to not only create a cultural genocide, but also enforce very strict patriarchal and heteronormative norms and rules onto Native American, American Indian populations that have had devastating effects. And yeah, that's very much true. Definitely climate disasters, yes. By capitalist exploitation, yeah. War, yeah. Sophia, yeah. You nailed it right there.
I think kind of going off of the comment that you said about how a lot of like colonial states have imposed hierarchies in terms of like gender and sexual expression and identity. I think what we're seeing today and like also within the past couple of decades is like those same states using these hierarchies that they fabricated as a means to justify their imperial, I guess, ventures. So like what we see with like pinkwashing like Israel, and how Israel is like kind of like painted as like a very queer friendly country, even though they're still actively persecuting queer Palestinians and queer people, other queer folks in the Middle East, and also like in the US in terms of like creating another layer of justification for their wars in the Middle East, and painting the Middle East and painting a lot of Islamic Muslim countries as very homophobic, even though a lot of the laws that are in place in those countries that like punish homosexuality, queerness, and so on were brought in by the Europeans.
Absolutely. You
So
just covered my whole slide. So yeah, no, very important. Yeah, perfect, Danish. Like, yes. I mean, I think that's the other, that's one of the things that I kind of want to emphasize, because I think a lot of these conversations around immigration, and we're just focusing on, we could focus on a lot of other things, is that we kind of take this, like, at least even in the news, an ahistorical approach. Like, oh, it's happening now because of this or this administration. And you're like, Yeah, there's a long history of this, and you know, and there's a lot of it's a lot of intertwined, and a lot of it just is very much at the root of it is around imperialism and colonialism, because it never really ended. It's still there, and recognizing that system of power not only makes us understand how things happen, but also makes us be more accountable to it. So it's not just that, oh wow, like for example, like the kill the gays in bill that happened in Uganda, like, oh wow, Ugandans seem really like backwards. It's like, no, there's a lot of things happening there that we here in the United States are also complicit in causing something like that to happen. So yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so we need to move forward for time, so, and to push forward. So I think, you know, a lot of us have covered and sort of talked about, but you know, a core part about that we're trying to get to in this lecture and this conversation is around the regulation of migration, and to be really critical about particularly the conversations around who's allowed to come here, who's worthy of asylum, who also, you know, deserves protection and who doesn't, because a lot of it is based on these same racial, gender, sexual hierarchies that have been embedded within the United States since the first settlers came here. Okay. Next slide. So talking about then the population that I work with and, you know, areas that I work within, you know, I think it's a loaded question about, you know, how does the U.S. Treat, and how does the U.S., you know, treat LGBTQ people? Now, we could talk about the current administration in many ways, which we will, but, you know, a lot of it, again, is about retracing those roots. So when we think about the US, especially in regards to sexuality and gender identity, we have this conflicting story. We have a country that, you know, its history and a public image that it shows very well to other countries of being, in some ways, the birthplace of the LGBTQ, or at least the Western LGBTQ rights movement, right? Stonewall, the Pride Parade, the rainbow flag, all of that. At the same time, we have a country where violence against LGBTQ people remains relatively high, especially towards transgender people, especially towards trans persons of color, where we have a country where over 45% of homeless youth are LGBTQ, where 1 in 3 transgender people experience homelessness in their lifetimes. It is important to situate, just the same thing as I was talking about immigration laws now, it's important to situate the history of LGBTQ lives, queer lives, sexual and gender minority lives in the context of settler colonialism. Since from the first settlers that have come to this land, sexuality and gender have always been used to regulate, dominate, and oppress individuals. By sexualizing colonized people, American Indian, Native American individuals, as well as other marginalized settlers coming or being forced to come here, you create a moral, sexual, and gender hierarchy that enforces your dominance over others. This is very much the case when you look at the history of how the US government and the settler colonialism has treated, for example, Native American women. Not only stripping them of sovereignty, so literally not being legally recognized as having citizenship rights and tribal rights as women, therefore enforcing a patriarchal system, but overtly sexualizing them and casting them as immoral, not good mothers, sexually available. A good case, click, is with the history of Pocahontas. And we could talk more about this, but like, here's something to think about. Pocahontas was a 13-year-old girl who was kidnapped and sexually assaulted by her white captors. Yet we glamorize Pocahontas in this country to a very shocking extent. It makes no surprise that this history of sexualization of Native American women, you see then the highest rates of violence against women are towards Native American women. Most of the violence happening by non-Native persons. Same-sex sexual acts have always been criminalized, specifically when you talk about sodomy and so forth, as well as coverture laws, which basically criminalized you for, I'm going to put these in big quotation marks, impersonating the opposite sex. A lot of these laws were aimed at controlling sexualities and gender expressions of of incoming non-white immigrants, African Americans, and Native Americans. We owe so much to the LGBTQ activists who have dedicated their lives and well-being. But at the heart of the story now playing out in so many schools and workplaces across the United States has been around the stripping of the rights that have been already given. And a lot of that is about reinforcing or just basically still enforcing heteronormativity and cisnormativity in all aspects of life, but especially in the legal realm. And for those of you who don't know the term heteronormativity, essentially it refers to a social, cultural, political process of reinforcing heterosexual privilege, seeing heterosexuality as normal, as the only sort of naturally, that everybody's naturally heterosexual. It reinforces a strict gender and sexual and strict gender binary and sexual hierarchy. Cisnormativity is the same sort of thing that's very much, you can see present in institutions today. It demonizes gender nonconforming individuals as abnormal or dangerous, the assumption being that cisgender is normal and anything else outside of that is abnormal. So just moving on, just because for the sake of time, we're gonna kind of jump through a little bit faster. So we've come a long way if you talk about the United States in regards to rights, but there's still a long way to go. This is a map actually that just recently came out by Mapping LGBTQ Equality, and we can put the link to it in the chat if you want to look at the full report. And what you see is that the orange sections, or the lighter orange sections, refers to less than 25% of the policies, and these are state policies. We're not talking about federal, we're talking about state policies that in regards to legal protections for LGBTQ individuals, including housing protections, employment, students, health, education, healthcare, hate crime legislation. What you see in this map, hopefully, and the red means 0%, the orange means less than 25, green is 50%, and darker green is over 50%. Hopefully what you can see in this map is that regardless of the gains that we have made, where you live in the United States drastically impacts your livelihood, how well you're going to be protected, whether you're going to get denied housing or not, and if you can fight against that denial. So in many ways, as much as we can celebrate the achievements that we've made, we are not all living equally. And that's really important to think about. All right, moving on. And that's really important when we then think about LGBTQ rights globally, because there is this sort of idea that, you know, that the United States, as well as other countries, but focusing on the United States, is progressive, that it has the sort of rights and legal recognitions and so forth to be considered, you know, a country that is not as bad or not as terrible as other countries, such as in Sudan, which they do have the death penalty. But one thing that I always tell people when we look at LGBTQ rights globally is that laws are the first step, but laws aren't the only thing. So you can have laws in the books, such as in Mexico, where they had actually same-sex marriage way before the United States had same-sex marriage legally. Mexico, depending on where you live in Mexico, depending on the amount of resources that you have, same story here in the United States, doesn't mean that you're given protection or safety. And incredible amounts of violence happen. Same thing here in the United States. So while this map shows, you know, because they're only looking at legally of places that seem to be safer than others, recognize that one, the story is much more complicated and much more that we need to be critical of. Okay. And this gets us then to thinking about homonationalism. So homonationalism is a big term, but it really actually means some pretty basic things and straightforward. It describes the use of gay rights, or the idea of gay rights, that like a country has, you know, progress, has protections for gay rights, celebrates gay lives, against racialized others. And what it is essentially is the blending of gay rights with extreme nationalism. And it describes, therefore, the acceptance and inclusion of some gay people, like your Mitch and Cam from Modern Family. That's the one that I usually go to. So if you're white, able-bodied, rich, and we don't see what you are, you know, we know that you're gay, but you don't, you know, everything else. I could go on about Mitch and Cam. Anyways, it's not about Mitch and Cam. So you have this sort of hierarchy of like the acceptable gay and then everybody else, right? So if you were poor, if you were trans, if you were a migrant, if you were disabled, etc., right? Not being sort of seen as part of the national ideal. So what this does is it regulates who can be sort of protected and celebrated and who isn't. And what then the United States government uses in this blending of gay rights and nationalism is to project an image around the world of being this mecca, for a better word, of gay acceptance rights and abilities so that they can then project that onto other countries as being backwards. Or in the case of the United States in regards to its military efforts as a way to invade countries. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Homonationalism very much depends on a term called Orientalism. Orientalism, in a very short way, is basically about creating an us versus them. It creates the idea that Western countries, such as the United States, are exceptional or more advanced than Eastern countries, such as places in the Middle East, South Asia, parts of Africa, and so forth. And especially in regards to being more advanced in regards to moral and human behavior, and therefore then contrasting Eastern countries as being backwards, religious zealots, barbaric, less advanced. So in the case of the United States versus countries in the Middle East, let's say Iran or Pakistan, homonationalism works to cast these countries as backwards, homophobic and transphobic, in contrast to the supposed utopia, which we know doesn't exist, of the United States. It also works very much for US military policies, such as, for example, during the War on Terror, you remember that? After 9/11, you had supporters in this country and within the Bush administration supporting military invasion of Iraq by saying that not only are we going to find these weapons of mass destruction, remember that, but that they were also there to liberate women and LGBTQ individuals from their oppression. So combining like this idea that we're here to liberate others, even though even at the time, there wasn't anything protections for same-sex marriage, LGBTQ people were still banned from the military, like a lot of sort of issues were still very much happening in this country. The Trump administration has used homonationalism in regards to their Muslim ban, in which the Muslim ban that came in 2017, where Trump banned foreign nationals from 7 predominantly Muslim countries. Part of the rhetoric that he used was that he was protecting women, children, and gay people from these potential threats. It's the same rhetoric that he uses for stopping immigrants from coming to the southern border and claiming asylum. So he's not that inventive. He oftentimes repeats himself. So there you have it. Okay, moving forward. So all of this, and I know I've covered a lot of territory and I apologize if I've been rushing through, but we do want to have time for discussion. What you see is some of the most vulnerable of migrants being doubly impacted by this, right? All of these sort of forces, where you have LGBTQ migrants and asylum seekers being basically denied at the border from entry or claiming asylum. You have greater sort of scrutiny for people claiming asylum on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, because no longer are they seen as either worthy of protection or that their persecution, the experiences that they've experienced in regards to homophobic or transphobic violence, not be considered by the Border Patrol, customs agents, and so forth as being persecution. So you see then this sort of issue where all of these policies that have been taken place are being used to essentially deny LGBTQ people from being able to claim asylum or seeing that they are worthy of asylum. Other issues that have been particularly impacting LGBTQ migrants has been around these detention centers, where again, there is limited access in regards to what's happening there. And unfortunately for people like myself who advocates and works with people on their asylum claims, I don't know who's in there. I don't know if you're a trans person or you're a queer person who is in need of asylum. And recently we have heard about issues around violence, particularly around trans people in these detention centers, being denied rights, experiencing sexual violence, and so forth, not getting proper medical treatment. So it is, like many other people in these detention centers, a real case of human rights abuse. And then lastly, the Remain in Mexico policy is particularly dangerous for LGBTQ migrants. Part of that has been also, one is that Mexico is not always safe for LGBTQ individuals, especially if you don't have the resources and so forth to get protection, you know, being able to stay in a shelter that's safe for you and so forth. The other sort of issue is that for those who have HIV and AIDS, so that includes everyone beyond just LGBTQ individuals, the Remain in Mexico has meant that many sort of asylum seekers or migrants who might be HIV/AIDS positive, they're forced to remain in Mexico where there is limited access to antiretroviral drugs, as well as other protections. So what has it meant is that many people are having to stay there and die. And so we see huge human rights abuses, even though, you know, you can claim asylum based on having HIV/AIDS, on your HIV/AIDS status. The Remain in Mexico policy, as well as many of the other policies, makes it so that it's virtually impossible. I can definitely talk more, and if you have any questions about what happens in the asylum process, especially in regards to trying to have to prove your sexual orientation and gender identity to a Border Patrol officer who has a very limited, oftentimes, definition of what it means to be gay or trans, as well as the sort of issues around detention centers and other policies. But I do want to give time for more conversation. So let's move on, but happy to talk more about this.
Can we put a pin in the, can you talk about that picture when we go to the Q&A? Because I think that what you put in that slide is really important. Which
picture?
The one on the previous slide right here.
Oh, yeah. I will definitely talk about that. So that's one of the things, and something that I talk a lot about, is around how you have to, because technically LGBTQ individuals are members of a particular social group, you actually have to prove basically prove that you are who you say you are. You are gay, you are trans. And trust me, there have been plenty of cases where you have some outrageous accusations by asylum officers, immigration courts that sort of deny people based on that they don't think that they're gay enough. I will talk way more about that if you're interested, for sure.
Sorry.
Okay, so, but I do want to have now time to talk, and I do appreciate all of you who've joined me on this. I know it was a lot of lecture in the beginning, but you know, I always want to make sure that we're on the same page when we talk about these large terms, right? And we could spend hours just talking about each one. But with this, you know, the focus and what I've sort of, what we all sort of want to sort of get to, especially for our positionalities, is how do we navigate these oppressive systems? So for myself, as somebody who works, as somebody who works with refugees in their asylum cases, I am often conflicted, because on one hand, I know that I am working within a system that is capitalist, that is settler colonial, that is racist, that is sexist, that is homophobic, and me working through it continues to keep the system going. On the other hand, the people that I'm working with are in dire consequences, right? Like, it's about like if they're going to live or die. And that sort of immediacy and importance of their lives means that I have to navigate these systems. So then how do we, as activists, practitioners, and so forth, how do we navigate these oppressive systems, and how do we negotiate that within ourselves as well within our own practice?
Thank you, Kat, so much. We really appreciate. I could listen to you talk for hours about this stuff. Can we go to the next slide? I'm going to introduce myself, and I'll have the others introduce themselves as they speak. I'm Vikrant. I'm a third-year medical student at University of Illinois College of Medicine, and I am one of the trainees who's going to be speaking on behalf of Chicago People's Rights Collaborative, the medical legal clinic that's also co-hosting this session. I think what we wanted to get at is in any kind of work that we want to do for racial justice, for working with migrants, anything, we really need to be self-reflective and self-aware and understand our own positionalities. And we've talked about positionality in previous sessions through CHC4BL in various ways. But I think in this, we really wanted to focus on what our relationship is to the state and our migration histories. And so for myself, I can comment, I identify as queer, I'm Punjabi, but I'm also upper caste and Hindu. And so one of the things I wanted to touch on is what Kat said earlier when talking about how when we all have differential experiences as settlers in the US. And part of what I wanted to address is that as someone who's upper caste and Hindu, I also migrated from a settler colonial project in Jammu and Kashmir that India is enacting on indigenous Kashmiri folks, along with Pakistan and China, now to come to the US, another settler colonial project against indigenous Americans. And so I want us to think about how our other identities that we bring through our, when we recognize our migration histories also impacts the ways in which we interact in the US. I know in many diasporic South Asian communities, caste is still ever present and just as important as it is within the subcontinent. And so that's just something I wanted to put out there and address in that moment. And also adding to the piece on our relationship to the state, I think Kat's point on homonationalism is well made because I do identify as queer and I do hold an oppressed identity, a queer oppressed identity in the US, but I also know that my identity, or at least the myth of homonationalism, weaponizes my identity and the treatment of people who identify similarly as I do, maybe differentially because of other identities, and weaponize that to, again, invade other countries and to exploit people across the world and within the US. So I just wanted to think about that when I think about my relationship to the state. Cool. I'll pass off to Sophia.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. In terms of like positionality, I think working towards like my understanding of being a settler is something that still needs to evolve like further and further. And I think also just taking time to recognize that we're all growing through this. I think it took me until I was like 22 to like realize I was like, oh, I'm in double diaspora. And so my parents' family was a part of forced migration known as a partition in the subcontinent, which to my knowledge is the largest singular event of human migration in documented human history. And, you know, I think when people frame migration as something that's very opportunistic, that's true, but it often erases the like very real pain that people feel from cutting the cord from everything that's familiar. The idea that people enjoy leaving, you know, land that their family's family and family's family has been on for as long as they can remember is hard. People don't do that easily. And so myself, I've never been able to, as a family, reconnect with any of the family that we have in India. And because of the ways I feel like post-colonial states or colonial states, however you want to call it, have learned from the US immigration system, it's impossible for my family to ever go back. They ask for who your maternal grandparents were, everything. And so I think thinking about not just imperialism with an extraction, but also how the structures here are learned and exported abroad to be practiced there as well. I think that that's something that's like very understated. Migration was a lot more fluid. There were not borders in the same way that we understand them now. And so it's definitely something that I think about a lot. In terms of my relation to the state and immigration, I think my family would be considered economic migrants to the US, which is an interesting term in of itself, because what does that mean? I don't know. I think one thing I'd like to throw out there is that, we call immigration immigration. It's always interesting to grow up and see the vernacular around the US being a safe haven for places, when in reality, immigration is heavily regulated by capitalism, and you are the most appealing immigrant if you have the most degrees and you are able to offer income. And I don't know if there's space to get into this in particular, but some work I was engaged in a couple of years ago in Europe, particularly in Athens. And if you want to see like migration and like the pains of it very visible, going to Europe is where it'll be very visible as well. Afghans were considered economic migrants to a large majority of Western Europeans. So that was the fact that countries and imperial states are allowed to define what is trauma for an entire community, and deciding that as an Afghan, even after having your land bombed and droned and militarized decade after decade, that you are an economic migrant. But if you're Syrian and if you have a college degree, you're not an economic migrant. And how that creates even more hierarchies within a refugee space, visibilized, and people lighting themselves on fire, like in camps, because they don't have access to the same asylum procedures. And so just thinking about all of that, the reality of fences and people being stuck at fences and being stuck on islands and being stuck everywhere. It's amazing to see how people can kind of like go about and not realize how this has just become even more visible, like decade after decade. Sorry if I got off topic.
I can go next. Hi everyone, I'm Danish. I use he, him pronouns. I identify as queer as well. I'm a practicing Muslim and also Pakistani. And kind of similar to what Sophia said, my grandparents also migrated from India to Pakistan during partition. So kind of the context behind that, similar to what Sophia was said, it was mostly to seek safety just because of the double religious persecution from both sides of the border. So like Sophia said, it's a very hard decision to make. Like my grandparents, all their siblings still live in like India, so we can't really go back to see them. And I think kind of to add that is that like we don't really have much of a connection with them. So like if I ask my parents like, oh, how do you feel about like seeing like your uncles or cousins in like India? And she's like, oh, I don't really think much about it because I never knew them to begin with. So I think like that's something that I think about a lot, because a lot of my cousins that I have right now that are immediate to me, like I know them, I'm very close to them. But like my parents, they don't really have that like extensive network and social sort of like network that like comes with family because of these borders kind of in place by colonialism. Just trying to go, and like I guess like another aspect of my positionality is that my parents also migrated from Pakistan to the US, and similar to what Sophia said, it was more of an economic migration. It wasn't necessarily to seek safety, but to seek better opportunities. So there are different implications for that. So we're not necessarily, I'm not at least someone who is seeking, who's part of a family background immediately through my parents, a migration pattern where I'm seeking safety. However, so that's something that I have to keep in mind whenever like I'm engaging in sort of like like a discourse around migration. Just kind of going back to sort of the topic on homonationalism, I think like what's been interesting for me is like, since I'm both like a practicing Muslim and also like identify as queer, I think that's always been a very interesting point of contention for me, just because like having both identities and like being very closely tied to both of them, like you don't feel like you belong in either space, because you know a lot of discourse around Muslim spaces is that they're anti-queer, homophobic, and not to say that they aren't, they are very homophobic, and I think like that has to be unpacked on its own, and especially its relationship with colonialism and how that had an impact on like kind of the perception of queerness in Islamic spaces. I think at the same time, there also exists a lot of like, there's not really a space for people who identify as Muslim or queer, or also like just queer people of color in like queer spaces in the West, because a lot of them are dominated by white people, cis white men. And oftentimes like their idea of queerness is very much stemmed and ties very closely with whiteness. So it's not something that I personally feel comfortable with being a part of either. So I think like when I navigate sort of like spaces where I'm trying to critique like, you know, homophobia in Muslim spaces and South Asian spaces, I feel like I have to be very careful, because anything I could be used against me, and it could be used against like the Muslim community, the South Asian community, and it could be used to further like US imperial projects and like the Middle East, and just like in general, like enforced discourse where that's anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, anti-South Asian. So I think it's just something that I've had to keep in mind in terms of like my positionality as someone who's queer, and like whose discourse could kind of create an argument for people in the US to like, you know, be skeptical of Muslims, to be skeptical of like people from Pakistan, to be skeptical of people in the Middle East. So it's just like a very interesting position to be in.
I think I'm next, right? Thank you to everybody for sharing. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thanks also, Kat, for an amazing summary of so many huge and important topics. I'm really grateful I get to be here and be part of it. And to everyone who's already shared, I appreciate hearing your stories too. I think in terms of my positionality, I mean, I come from like on both sides. I'm white, and I definitely have like the settler side, particularly on my mom's side, she's her family's been in the United States for multiple generations, and definitely settlers. And then on my dad's side as well, but my dad's parents came to the U.S. from Germany, and I actually don't really know much. They were very private about their reasons for coming, and they really very strongly believed in assimilation. My dad didn't learn German. My grandparents spoke it. My dad did not. It was kind of like cut off in his generation. So, but I think obviously still part of the, I think, settler background. I think other positionalities I have is I'm also queer. I am a queer cisgender woman, and so a white queer cisgender woman, which I think particularly when you talk about the Mitch and Cam aspect of the LGBTQ community, that is brings up so many thoughts for me. And I think recognizing the queer experience in the United States is very different for people. So for people within the LGBTQ community, I think, you know, I have my own experiences of coming out as queer within my family and being cut off from parts of my family, but at the same time being able to live with my wife in Chicago without living in constant fear. But I know that's not true even within the United States, even within Chicago, within my own neighborhood for people within the LGBTQ community. So I think understanding that different experience for people is so important for me. I don't think I really introduced myself either, and my kind of part in this is I have been doing forensic asylum evaluations for the last 5 years or so, since I was a resident and now as an attending. And I think it's been an interesting experience to me. I mean, hearing the stories of queer asylum seekers or LGBTQ asylum seekers, it always speaks to me, partly, or obviously because of my own queer identity. But I think also, Kat, when you started talking about your participation in a system while also feeling complicit in it, like you're seeing the person in front of you that I'm doing this evaluation for, and I want them to be granted asylum, to be let out of the detention center where I'm seeing them doing an evaluation within this like prison, and at the same time recognizing how insane it is that I need to be the person that says that what they experienced qualifies them for asylum in the first place. Like, why does the system exist the way it is? At the same time, wanting so badly to be able to provide that to advocate for people in that way, and feeling so powerless in changing the system in other ways. So I think there's a lot we could talk about with that, but I think that's one of the ways that I have seen my role in this, and it's one I think about frequently, about how we can kind of reconcile those things.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think for all of you guys and myself for sharing. I think going into what we wanted to talk about, I think Sarah, you bring up a really important point: is what is our role in dismantling these systems? And at this point, if we could go to the next slide, we want to break out into small groups, and again, feel free to. It's really just going to be dependent on what the group wants. We can talk about any of these things that are on this. We can talk about something else. But the idea is for us to really think about what our role is in this and dismantling these systems. We're all coming from this differently. I know there is quite a lot of people in healthcare, but there are quite a few people on here that are also not. And so I think we're all going to be approaching this very differently. I think it would be really interesting for us to talk about that. So we're going to pause the recording. Hey everyone, bringing us back. Sorry, we got cut off. I don't know if other groups got cut off, but we totally just got cut off in the middle of a conversation.
Sorry.
No, it's not your fault, Cami. You can't be in multiple places. Can we all, maybe the facilitators in the small groups, maybe we can all kind of share, yeah, exactly. Maybe we can all share kind of what some of the things that we talked about. Do any of the facilitators want to go first before we move on?
I can start. We talked about kind of navigating institutions and whether we're like comfortable or want to do work within the institutions that we're a part of, or are looking to do work outside of those spaces and what that looks like, and just also thinking about kind of our own positionalities as we think about what it means to be like quote unquote professionals, and how coded that those terms can be also.
Yeah. Our group, we talked a little bit about what it means to like navigate doing work inside and outside institutions, and what that can look like and what that means. We talked about how just about everything we do in an institution is co-opted and turned into a publicity stunt. So that was something that we talked about. And we also talked about how we navigate working within and outside systems while also like participating in it as workers, as students, etc. Yeah.
Our group got to the point where we were reflecting on positionality, and then we were abruptly cut short. No offense to Cami. But if folks in our group want to offer up any reflections that they had on how we participate in harm and how we try to enact some of what we've learned today, hope folks feel comfortable with taking that up. I just wanted to add that as someone who's like just transitioned into like being a trainee and a medical student, I'm not a medical student, sorry, I'm the resident now, at UIC, it's incredibly hard to do harm reduction education in your immediate spaces and be disoriented by all of these hierarchies, and then come to community spaces and be like, wait, nope, that's not where I am right now. It's extremely disorienting. And I think since a lot of the folks in this space are coming from health types of spaces, it's so arbitrary, and to not feel like you can critique all that arbitrariness all the time because people who are above you don't know what that is. It's a lot. And I think that, even like these types of spaces, again, why those aren't embedded into education, why we don't learn how biomedicine itself, the biomedicine that we learn and practice is like a very Western type of biomedicine. And we get to situate it as like objective and pretty and invisible. And not that in of itself is a cultural practice that you're practicing on people. As someone who's like in psychiatry, it's very visible because it's like, oh, is this pathologic or like cultural? I have had a patient who like almost got antipsychotics because she was praying in her room, and I was like, oh my God, no, she's not psychotic, don't give her that. And I was like, what would happen if I wasn't on this team? So I think that like finding where you spread yourself. Like I'm learning, like I need to be in more community, non-institutional spaces, so I don't bring the toxicity from that space into something else. It's something that I think about regularly.
Yeah. If there's anything folks want to share, this is a time. Feel free to reflect as a large group. We have slides, but we can always, you know, you'll get them later. So don't worry about that. If you want to share anything right now, feel free to. I'm a fan of the lingering silence, so I'll wait another minute and then move on.
We talked a little bit about this, but I would like you to talk more about it. You wrote Western medicine is a colonial model of medicine. Talk about this some more, because I think that's also, like, we've been talking about immigration, and that's because that's where I'm coming from, but we can talk about these same conversations in regards to medicine, especially here in the United States.
Yeah, it's several things. I don't know how to condense it into like one quick thing, but into one soundbite. But I think the piece of it is that medicine, as we see it, was developed by like colonial powers. So, you know, it was developed by the UK, France, Spain a little, and a few other European countries, and then also in the US with the birth of antebellum medicine. So antebellum medicine, specifically thinking about medicine in the South. And what we see throughout history is that medicine was built on a history of exploitation. So whether that's through medical experimentation, whether that is through, and so the more recent legacies that people are mentioning is a history of sterilization and how gynecology, at least modern gynecology, was developed from the experimentation on Black enslaved women. That's a legacy right there in how that experimentation also is part of the legacy of forced sterilization of Black Indigenous women, folks who were disabled or differently abled in any way. It's part of that movement of eugenics. The other piece around the colonial medicine model of medicine that I want to touch on is that there were several / still several indigenous models of medicine that exist both in the US, both and in Canada, North America, South America, and also across the world. And all of those indigenous medicines are devalued because they don't have scientific merit, because there isn't scientific research. But if the people doing the research aren't those folks, how would there ever be scientific merit? So there is the piece there of that these same medicines now, we are seeing that some people, like, for example, I always bring up South Asian medicines, but yeah, exactly, because they can't be capitalized and sold. But now, more recently, people started researching different, specific like alternative medicines, and now we have a whole field of complementary and integrated medicine, where people talk about the anti-inflammatory benefits of different herbs, spices that were used throughout societies across the world, but now are sold in packaged pills that the supplement industry can profit from. So that's all I was going to say about that. But colonial models of medicine.
There's another workshop.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing.
I was
Cue
going to
the
add to
turmeric
that,
latte.
just in a sense, this actually came up. You know, UIC has an anti-racism urgent action committee, which is a new type of name for a group. But sitting there in the meeting, I was like, how many people in this space can like actually give or provide a definition of race? And I guarantee if you polled most people, they would give you a biological definition of race. And I leave the room because that's it. I think medicine reaffirms, not only is a byproduct of these structures, but like happily participates and affirms Black people need this type of medicine. This is that. And I'm like, excuse me, like, what are you talking about? And so that kind of like social Darwinism is a part and practice of our field and is evidence-based, if there's nothing outside of evidence-based. And so it's what's I think particularly harmful about it is that people who are attempting to do work that they near understand as decolonial or liberatory are actually reaffirming these structures and participating, because I think, Kat, to your point earlier, we don't acknowledge how you're already a participant of harm, you're kind of moving in a way that is, you don't realize is pretty irresponsible from what you're putting out there. That's my thought on it, at least.
I think to add on to that, one thing that I notice a lot about like standards of care is that it's very often informed by social norms within like US society. And often the people who decide these standards of care are the same people who are in the positions of power in the hospital. So like they're the same position. So it's just very interesting when you're asking people who aren't the recipients of such treatment, such medical care, to decide what is the standard of care for a person who wants to seek out a treatment or wants to see a doctor for such and such. So like there's very little input from people, especially like marginalized folk, on what does it look like to be treated with dignity in these spaces? What does it look like to be treated medically, but also to be treated as an individual in light of your own cultural background, your view of life, and to not have that be compromised when you're in like a very white, cisnormative, heteronormative space like the hospital.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say something because anytime people talk about alternative medicine, I feel like a responsibility to say something about it because I did my dissertation on it. Basically, when we talk about like indigenous medicine in the United States, it's not as easy as just like erasure and like replacement in terms of like secular colonialism histories. Like when the United States itself was developing American medicine, it did so on the backs of indigenous nations, like to create a distinction from European medicine, like as part of the American Revolution thing, which is like a long history, but then more that ties in more recently to, we have like a national center. Well, it's called the Office. It was really called the Office for the Study of Unconventional Medical Practices in the National Institutes of Health. That quickly became the Office of Alternative Medicine. And the way that they like legitimized and authenticated this center was through like connecting it to indigenous medicine, like North American indigenous medicine. And they actually, the first director that they hired was an American Indian pediatrician who like was the perfect representation of the blend between like the primitive and the modern, and like this in-between space of alternative medicine, now for the first time being researched officially in a federal research institution. And like that indigeneity, that indigenousness was useful and like anthropologically, scientifically useful and legitimizing in the early 90s until it became an institution, and then no longer, and like removed indigeneity as a centerpiece, because actually that director started bringing up issues of sovereignty within medical research, and like what it means, like what you said, Vikram, what it means to like study medicine, alternative medical therapies, or like non-normative medical therapies through different kinds of research practices that don't require the same kind of like gatekeeping and institutional barriers. So they kicked him out and then had white men and women run it for the rest of its history, and then started to bring in like South Asian modalities and like, I mean, there's a whole other racial thing, but like South Asian, East Asian modalities as like practitioners and as like the modalities, and then like Latino patients and Black patients as like the patients, and then white providers and East Asian providers as the providers. Like it's just, it became a whole other racial like cacophony, and which is also part of like a move into like multiculturalism And then Latinos, this is like was the end of my project, but basically like Latinos adopting alternative medicine, and alternative medicine being seen as like a Latino only issue in terms of like herbs and like whatever. That's a long other story, but it ends up, Latinidad ends up replacing indigeneity and making something that was originally a political sovereign autonomy question into like a multicultural race issue. And that's also like a settler colonial multicultural form. So that's a synopsis of my dissertation. Sorry to like go through the whole thing, but I just like, it's something that in terms of like thinking about what we're doing here and like just having like I had no idea, like I wanted to go into medicine and like integrate alternative medicine into my future practice. And I just had no idea like the history and the roots of like what that would mean for me as a Latino patient, a Latino provider, like engaging in that multicultural, like culturally competent or culturally conscious like work. So anyways.
I think more
Sorry
important.
for the monologue.
I think more importantly, are you going to drop the dissertation link or?
It's actually, I'm like taking this time, my dedicated enrichment time to like publish my chapter or
Okay.
a couple chapters. So
okay, well then we'll keep in touch.
I'll be dropping that link.
Yeah, send it to me. I'll send it to everyone here. Yeah, exactly. Yes. So I know we at the time we were supposed to end is at 8:30. So please, we want to be respectful of your time. Feel free to log off whenever you need to. Some of us may still be here to talk about other stuff. We still have other stuff that we can talk about, did want to talk about, and we might still be doing that if there's folks who are here who still want to listen to it. But again, 8:30 was the end time, so if you want to and need to go, please do so. So I just wanted to say that now before we start talking about the other stuff.
So I will need to log off just because I have to teach another class, but I put my email in the chat. So any of you who want to like talk about anything that I've touched upon or the refugee work, send me an email. I love talking about this stuff. So yeah, and thank you so much for giving your energy to this. It was so great listening to all of you. And thank you for Vikrant and everyone for organizing this. And yeah, all respect to all of you.
Thank you so much for also joining us from California. We really appreciate that. Yeah.
Bye, everybody.